You know, it's kind of crazy when you think about how fast everything escalated. What started as scattered protests across the country slowly grew into something nobody could ignore anymore. At first, people said it would fade away like all the other political movements, a few weeks of shouting, then back to normal. But this time, it didn't fade. It kept growing. Day by day, city by city, until it wasn't just protest signs and marches anymore. It became an uprising, and the government started losing control of the streets. The Trump administration tried to hold its ground, speeches, emergency laws, even curfews, but none of that worked. Every new crackdown just added more fuel to the fire. The protests became bigger, louder, angrier. And what if one day, it happened, the unimaginable? The No King protest successfully achieved its goals. No one really saw that exact moment coming. It wasn't one big explosion, more like a slow, unstoppable wave. Cabinet members started resigning, state officials refused to follow federal orders, and military loyalty began to split. Social media was chaos, half the country celebrating what they called freedom, the other half terrified that the system itself was falling apart. For the first time in modern U.S. history, the nation entered a leadership vacuum, the old administration collapsing while the country waited for a new election to restore order. Confusion reigned, with no clear authority to unify the states, only uncertainty and rising tension filling the gap. Financial markets immediately crashed. Investors don't like surprises, especially not the sudden collapse of an administration as polarizing as Trump's. The dollar plunged as uncertainty spread, and trading floors turned into scenes of panic. Supporters claimed the markets would rebound once patriots took control, while others warned the economy was entering uncharted territory. The Federal Reserve issued statements promising stability, but no one knew who was really in charge or what policies would follow. Confidence, the one thing holding the system together, vanished almost overnight. Meanwhile, the rest of the world watched in shock. The outcome in Washington sent waves of uncertainty through global politics. Allies scrambled to predict what U.S. policy would look like in the new era. The European Union held emergency talks to stabilize markets, while China and Russia quietly assessed how to turn the situation to their advantage. Across Asia, currencies swung wildly as investors braced for shifting trade and security dynamics. The world wasn't watching America collapse, it was watching a power transition unfold with unpredictable consequences. Taxes, oh man, that turned into a battlefield. The change in Washington threw every financial system into confusion. Businesses didn't know which policies would stay or which tax reforms would be reversed. The IRS faced gridlock as new directives clashed with Trump-era regulations still on the books. Corporations froze investments, unsure what the next fiscal landscape would look like. For months, the U.S. economy felt like it was running on autopilot, waiting for clarity that never seemed to come. The global ripple was brutal. During Trump's years, markets had grown used to his unpredictable but aggressive economic style, heavy tariffs, bold spending, and constant pressure on trade partners. When that approach suddenly disappeared, the system lost its anchor. Countries that had adapted to Trump's hardline trade deals scrambled to adjust, unsure whether the next administration would lift barriers or double down. Bond markets swung violently as investors tried to price in a future without his fiscal influence. Even cryptocurrencies spiked amid the confusion, as people sought refuge from the turbulence. For a moment, it felt like the world was relearning how to function without the force that had dominated its economy for years. If the United States were to fall into severe turmoil amid a wave of nationwide protests, the reactions of rival powers would almost certainly emerge, though no one could predict how far they might go. In a period when Washington is deeply distracted, both Russia and China could quietly expand their spheres of influence, not necessarily through full-scale military force. Russia might increase military pressure in Eastern Europe, test NATO's responses, or intensify its information warfare to sow doubt about America's leadership capabilities. China, meanwhile, could strengthen its presence in the Asia-Pacific, ranging from expanded military drills around Taiwan to heightened activities in the South China Sea, to signal that the regional order is shifting. Other nations that depend on U.S. aid or protection, such as Ukraine, the Philippines, or South Korea, might find themselves in a state of psychological defensiveness, questioning whether Washington still has the capacity to safeguard them. However, all of this remains within the realm of hypothesis, as no one can accurately gauge how weakened the U.S. might become, or whether these countries would dare to cross real red lines. It would be a fragile period, one in which every action, whether a military exercise, a public speech, or even a single tweet, could ignite a far-reaching geopolitical transformation across the globe. Oil prices surged as the U.S. dollar weakened, shaking confidence in the long-standing petrodollar system. For decades, global oil had been priced in dollars, but the currency's decline forced producers to demand higher rates. Some nations began testing small oil trades in euros or yuan, signaling cracks in the old order. Central banks rushed to protect reserves as inflation spread worldwide. The dollar still dominated, but its grip on global energy no longer felt unbreakable. Even neutral countries like Switzerland and Singapore had to intervene. They set up emergency clearing systems to handle US-linked transactions and tax settlements. But it was like trying to repair a plane mid-air, too big, too fast, too fragile. The world had been tied to the American economy for so long that when it fell, everything else got pulled down with it. Back in the US, life turned into survival mode. Without federal leadership, states became their own microgovernments. Some formed regional alliances, the Pacific Coalition on the West Coast, the Atlantic Pact on the East. Each one claimed to represent the real America. Local currencies popped up. Taxes were paid directly to states or even city councils. In some places, digital IDs replaced federal records. You could drive 100 miles and cross into a totally different economic zone with its own rules, prices, and laws. People thought it would feel like freedom, but instead, it felt like confusion. You never knew what law applied where. One week your savings were worth something, the next week inflation doubled it away. Police forces were local only. The military split between regional commands. Former federal agencies like the FBI and IRS became fragments of their old selves, operating only where they still had staff. Outside the US, other nations started adapting. China quietly expanded influence, offering new trade routes with lower tariffs. The European Union formed an emergency council to stabilize currency exchange. Even Latin American countries like Brazil and Mexico rose in prominence as regional powerhouses. The global order reshuffled overnight. Taxes between countries became unpredictable, with new systems popping up to replace lost US infrastructure. A new kind of global economy began, more fragmented, more local, but also more unstable. For many Americans, the promise of taking back the country turned into the uncertainty of what came next. His sudden absence left a deep divide. Supporters felt leaderless, while opponents struggled to manage the fallout of years of polarization. Businesses hesitated, markets wobbled, and federal agencies slowed as new leadership tried to restore direction. The protests had won their moment, but the nation now faced a harder question: how to rebuild after the storm. It's weird, because in that alternate future, the US didn't vanish completely, it just fractured. Some regions thrived on innovation and local democracy, others descended into corruption or chaos. But the bigger story wasn't about politics anymore. It was about how deeply the world had depended on one country, and what happens when that country implodes. This video is just one of many possible scenarios, a world that could emerge if the No King protests truly succeeded in toppling the government from within. Because when people imagine that No King protest, or joke about overthrowing the system, they forget one thing: the collapse of a government doesn't just change politics, it changes everything. The economy, the markets, the tax systems, the way nations trade and trust each other. If the Trump administration ever truly fell from the inside out, it wouldn't just be an American event, it'd be the moment the entire world had to learn to live without its anchor.